Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 5th of March 2026, Jacopo Frascaroli of the University of Turin looks at the philosophical and empirical evidence for the idea that we make cognitive gains from our aesthetic experience. He does this by distinguishing two distinct senses of cognitive gain, one which is factive in the sense that the gain is truth evaluable, and one that is purely descriptive. He argues that the descriptive notion is the most relevant one and traces its roots through the history of philosophy to Gestalt psychology and to contemporary psychological models of predictive processing.
It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the session here today. We have a great session lined up, of course. Our speaker, as many of you know already personally, is Jacopo Frascaroli, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Psychology in Turin. He was awarded his PhD at the University of York in 2022, also under the guidance of Greg Curry, I believe, right? And has since then been producing some very interesting work, which is also very relevant for our project, not least on the role of predictive processing and in the experiences of art and aesthetic experiences in general. So we're very pleased to have him here. Jacopo is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about the same amount of time for discussion. So good, over to you.
So, thank you very much again, Elizabeth and Guy, for organizing this and inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to be able to speak here. I've been engaging with some of the previous talks, and I've been watching some of them online, and I look forward to engaging more with the whole project, which sounds very fascinating. So, what I thought I'd do today for you is to put some of my theoretical and empirical work as a philosopher by training, working in a psychology lab, to the service of what I take is one of the main questions of the aesthetic cognitivism and the prospect of criticism project, which is the question of aesthetic cognitivism. And in order to understand what is meant by that a little bit more, I just copied and pasted the sort of description of it that I found in the Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism website, which I think captures well the central idea. So the central claim of aesthetic cognitivism is that our aesthetic experiences are, most notably our experiences of art, are cognitively productive. That is, they yield knowledge and understanding about the world, ourselves, and the relation between the two. A weak view of aesthetic cognitivism involves the claim that some experiences of art can lead to knowledge. A stronger view holds that this knowledge, cognitive yield, is key and perhaps even essential to what it is to have an aesthetic experience. So I thought this description is pretty accurate, and also it sort of points to the differences between a weaker and a stronger view. And as I will show, there are reasons to think that a stronger view between the two is the more likely. But first, the important thing is to ask ourselves what we mean by cognitive yield exactly, or cognitive gain, because that's indeed a question that bothered me during my PhD project when I was working together with Greg Curry and Stacey Friend on a project called Learning from Fiction, and we were tasked with the aim to bridge the gap between the philosophical and psychological literature on the sort of cognitive gain that we can have engaging with fiction and fictional stories. And the point is that philosophers tended to perceive cognitive gain in a certain way, namely, they have a factive understanding of what cognitive gain is. That is, they take verbs such as learning, knowing, and understanding as being factive verbs, verbs that presupposes the truth of the object to which they apply. So, according to the philosophers, we have learning, we have cognitive gain only if the sort of experience we undergo takes us closer to the truth in some way. But what I noticed right from the start is that psychologists and neuroscientists do not have this same concept of cognitive gain. They do not talk, for example, about acquiring new justified true beliefs or skills that bring us closer to the truth of the matter. What they are interested in is rather pattern finding, basically. The way in which we come to find and embody patterns of information, patterns of probabilities from the environment. And this sense of cognitive gain is eminently non-factive, in the sense that the patterns that we find in the environment can also not be there. We can hallucinate them. Even conspiracy theorists learn in this sense, which is a non-factive sense of an understanding of cognitive gain. And the more I looked into this, and the more I was persuaded that if we want to capture really the sort of soul-altering, the transformative, the insight-generating power of art, which should stick to the descriptive sense of cognitive gain. Because indeed, if one takes the descriptive view, then it becomes fairly obvious that aesthetic experience and cognitive gain are constitutively related and have been indeed considered as such throughout the history of philosophy. So if we look in retrospect, given this view to the history of philosophy, we may find several hints and theories that relate in a fairly obvious way knowledge, acquisition, and beauty and aesthetic appeal, for example, as we shall see in a minute. So what I would like to do in the talk is to outline the sense in which these two things, aesthetic experience and cognitive gain, are related, and to propose a rearticulation of the debate on aesthetic cognitivism as a consequence of this. So the plan for the talk is pretty straightforward. I will be delineating this sort of relationship that I see between aesthetic experience and cognitive gain, starting from ancient Greek thought, going to predictive processing, which is sort of neuroscientific framework I'm exploring I've been exploring in recent years. Then I will present a case study. I will use specifically literature and language to understand this relationship between aesthetic experiences and cognitive gain. And then I will consider how, given what we will be saying, the debate on aesthetic cognitivism should be reconsidered. So let's start by saying something about how I see aesthetic experiences and cognitive gain as being related in a profound way, a profound non-factive way. So this is a very sort of generic points drawn from the history of philosophy, but basically the idea of a relation between cognitive gain and aesthetic appeal is already present in the age-old conception of beauty as harmony, which is basically some of the great theory of beauty, the theory of beauty that was prominent from Greek times up until the 17th century. In Greek thought, for example, in the cosmogonies, in Pythagorean thought, there is a strict relationship between beauty and knowledge in the sense that both are seen as the discovery of order. If we think, for example, the word cosmos in Greek means an harmonious arrangement of the kind that you can find in beautiful object. Cosmesis comes from the same term, and then only secondarily the totality of the universe as something embodying that very harmonious arrangement. So the thought in ancient Greek thought is basically that it's the harmonious arrangement of things that grounds both our perception of beauty and the discoverability of the cosmos. Then, of course, this sort of attention towards harmony, symmetry, and proportion, similar notions, was also central in the practice and the theories about art from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And then later on, we got notions which are very close to this idea, the notions of unity in variety, order in complexity, and so on. And also in the German rationalists, there was this talk of beauty as formal perfection. So, according to Leibniz, Wolff, and Baumgarten, for example, beauty was the intuition of perfection, and with perfection they meant, again, unity in variety, many different elements that fits together in a coherent and understandable way. So this was one of the main strands I take of the view of beauty across the history of Western thought, and here is another one that I think fits the picture quite neatly as well. Another major family of theories of beauty points in the same direction, in the sense that it affirms that what makes something beautiful is also what makes it recognizable as the thing that it is. So the butterfly here is not just beautiful because it presents an harmonious arrangement of colors and patterns, but also because this arrangement of colors and patterns makes it recognizable as that specific creature or the specific species that it is, for example. And this is a view that, of course, was generated by Plato and Aristotle, but was mostly articulated later on by Plotinus, according to which beauty is linked to the participation in or the realization of an idea, form, a principle that defines how the thing should be. And of course, it's also present in Platonic and medieval thought. Medieval thinkers thought as beauty as the splendor of form, the evidence that matter is organized in a specific way, in a way that it's both beautiful and understandable for the same reason. And it's intriguing to think, for example, that the terms that were used to define form in medieval times, form and species, forma and species, meant both the things that identify something as the things that it is, but also beautiful, as if the language was suggesting that what makes something identifiable as the thing that it is also makes it beautiful. And of course, we have like traces of the same kind of thinking in a functional theory of beauty, which is still alive today, in the sense that, for example, what makes a sort of particular arrangement of matter that make the butterfly be the kind of thing that it is, also makes it apt to fly, for example. So aptness to function can also be perceived in this cognitive way as capturing the essence of what the thing is. And this goes up to the present time, when there are lots of studies confirming that we tend to prefer things that are closer to the exemplar category, the exemplar of a certain category. We have a preference for prototypes, for example. So all these, I think these are very general points, just meant to illustrate that in other times, the sort of questions that we are considering had a rather obvious answer. Cognitive value, understanding, and beauty were strictly related. Now, the sort of step that we need to take now in order to approach cognitive science and more recent kind of thinking is to look at what Gestaltists were saying about perception at the beginning of the 20th century. So Gestaltists, people like Wertheimer, Kafka, and Köhler, were intrigued by the fact that we tend to organize our percepts in specific ways, and some perceptual organization are preferred over others. So if you haven't seen this picture before, it will probably appear as a random array of white and black patches. But if I now tell you that there is an animal here, and more specifically a cow, you may start to see it. If you don't see it, here are some cues. In the picture, you see mainly the face of the cow. Here are the ears of the cow. These are the eyes of the cow. And this is the snout of the cow. So if you now saw the cow, you did something pretty remarkable, which is to arrange scattered sensory data into something meaningful. And this is exactly the sort of kind of cognitive operation that the previous theories of beauty that we considered points towards, or arranging different elements in an orderly fashion. And that's indeed, as the Gestaltists discovered, what our perceptual system is doing all the time, right? So according to them, which weren't interested in beauty in the first place, but they noticed that perception tends naturally towards beauty in the sense that it tends to organize our percepts in the most coherent, stable, satisfying way possible. And they call this the law of the good gestalt, good is already an evaluative term, which is also aesthetic in nature. And people like Kafka were explicitly saying that, for example, perception is artistic because it tends to arrange our percepts in the most orderly fashion. Kafka was similarly noticing that violations of the law of the good Gestalt hurt our sense of beauty. So if we are not able to arrange our perception in an harmonious way, that hurts our sense of beauty. And Herrenfels was noticing explicitly that what we call beauty is nothing more than the level of a Gestalt. That is, how much we are able to arrive at a satisfying explanation, unifying explanation of what we are seeing. Now, in present day cognitive science, people do not talk about gestalts anymore. They tend to talk about different notions. For example, the notion of hypothesis or prediction, right? But the thought is essentially the same. One can think of a gestalt as an hypothesis about the causes of our sensations. The idea, articulated among others by Helmholtz, Gregory, is that all we have access to in our perceptual processes is the sensation hitting our sensory organs. We do not see the distal stimuli that generated it. So we need to infer among the infinitely many possible objects that may have caused these sensations, which are the true ones. And in most cases, we are able to do so instantly and very effectively. And the task of every theory of perception and cognition, more generally, is to clarify how we are able to do so. Right. If we take this sort of hypothesis, predictions kind of talk, we get to what predictive processing as a framework is saying, more or less. I won't be technical here, but basically, in the predictive processing picture, we have stimulations hitting our sensory organs. We have a perceiver. You can think about yourself while I was telling you that there was a cow in the picture. What happens according to predictive processing in this situation is that you generate a very abstract prediction about how a cow look like and what you should find in the picture if there is a cow there. Then this prediction is unpacked into more specific predictions about, for example, nose, eyes, ears, and so on. And these predictions are further unpacked into more concrete predictions about, for example, shapes, edges, colors, and further into expectations and predictions about specific patterns in your retina. So basically what is happening when you see the cow is that you are testing these predictions at all these hierarchical levels within your brain. And this story more or less follows the sort of hierarchical organization that sensory cortices have themselves. And you are also constantly confronting these high-level predictions with the bottom-up sensory signal that comes from the senses, and you are trying to reduce the mismatch between the two. And when you are able to reduce the mismatch, you perceive the world as structure. You see the cow in the picture, for example. So that's what cognitive gain basically is for people working in psychology, with different sort of terminological differences. But cognitive gain is basically constantly updating a model of how things should look like given your sensory input. Now, the next thing to notice is that this sort of operation that allows us to find structure in our sensorium, to perceive the world as organized, is also pleasurable according to this framework, because it means affirming our existence as a viable model of the world. The idea is that when I'm seeing the cow in the picture, I'm not just structuring my person, I'm also structuring myself and become the specific creature that sees that specific thing in the picture and not many other different things, for example. So finding structure in our sensorium also means structuring ourselves, creating ourselves in a sense, and affirming our existence as viable models of the world, and in particular, in this case, of that portion of your model of the world that tells you how cows look like, for example. So there is a sort of an empowering character of perceiving structure in your sensorium, because in this perspective, you become more able to predict and engage with and control the sort of stimulations that surround you, and you are effectively affirming yourself and your own existence as a viable model of the world. That's why perhaps when you perceive the cow in the picture, you got this sort of aha moment, this sort of pleasurable, affective response that comes with the sudden discovery of structure. So on these very grounds, several predictive processing theories of affect and well-being have been put forward that see perception and cognition as intrinsically effective. That's more or less also the intuition of the Gestalt people that were telling us that there is always value embedded in our perceptual and cognitive operations, because we want to find structure in our sensorium. We want to find beauty, in a sense. So once we are equipped with this story that tells us why finding structure in our sensorium is pleasurable, of course we can apply it to whatever we like. So the experience of architecture, of nature, even the sort of mundane experience of considering the arrangement of furniture in your living room, all involve, in a sense, the experience of finding structure in your sensorium in more or less pronounced ways. So the predictive processing view of aesthetic experience is that aesthetic experiences take place when we are particularly successful in finding structure in our sensorium. And this, I take, is a good way of rearticulating some of the old intuitions about beauty as being related to harmony, unity in variety, adherence to an idea form, and so on. Now, notice that why we are not experiencing, for example, aesthetic pleasure continually, because not all the stimulations that we encounter afford that finding structure to the same degree. If I gave you this cow, which was already clear, you wouldn't have experienced the pleasure of discovering structure in your sensorium. If you consider this other picture, you cannot find anything in it. So there will be constantly in our sort of experience a spectrum of experiences that ranges from the most mundane, predictable, and certain to the most uncertain, open-ended, and unpredictable. And when do we experience pleasure? We experience pleasure in cases that are in between, cases that maximize that possibility of going from not knowing to knowing, right? Because in this case, we know already. In this case, we cannot know. It is in these cases that we can maximize the cognitive gain that comes from finding new structure in our sensorium. And that's why many sort of empirical frameworks and empirical studies see this sort of inverted U-shaped function relation between uncertainty or complexity or unpredictability and aesthetic pleasure. So more or less an acquired result in cognitive psychology in lots of ways. Also in developmental psychology, where psychologists have found this, what they call the Goldilocks effect, the fact that infants tend to concentrate their attention on stimuli which are not too simple and not too complex in order to maximize their developmental trajectory. So indeed, there is a relationship, a fundamental relationship between cognitive gain and aesthetic pleasure in this perspective. Now, where does art come into the picture? Well, according to this view, art affords us the experience of successfully structuring our sensorium and ourselves to an enhanced degree. And it does so on a multiplicity of levels. For example, it can be a matter of guessing what objects are in the painting, but also of guessing, given that the objects are clear, which high-level hypotheses explain all the objects in the painting within an overall symbolic economy. It could be a matter of guessing the emotions of the people in the painting or the emotion expressed by the artist in the painting. It could be a matter of guessing the actions that went into the production of the painting, or it could be a matter of making very high-level hypotheses of how art should look like, for example. So there are this multiplicity of levels following the sort of hierarchical story that we have encountered, and guesses at one level informs guesses at another level continuously. So the idea is that art, when it functions well, it does so because it does so in a sustained fashion, and it keeps us guessing. Perhaps we have a high-level hypothesis about the meaning of the picture, and then by virtue of that, we scan the picture in a certain way, we discover in a low-level way a certain object, which rearticulates our high-level hypothesis about the picture, and so on continuously. And this, I take, explains why the experience of art is inherently inquisitive, generative, processual, and deeply integrated into our broader epistemic networks, as Elizabeth puts it in her recent paper. So if we want to understand, the point is that if you want to understand the power of art to affect us cognitively, we need to look at this sort of process, which is non-factive. This is, of course, a story that I've been articulated together with many other people. We have this special issue that tells this sort of predictive processing story about art. Diana Omighi, which will talk, I guess, next time at this seminar, has participated in this special issue. And together with Diana and Filippo, we are developing also the Arts and the Drive for Knowledge volume, edited volume, that hopefully will explore that very story further. So summing up so far, we have seen that both traditional theories of beauty and contemporary cognitive science indicate that aesthetic experiences and cognitive gain are intrinsically related, and both depend on our ability to find structure in our world. Artworks are designed to offer this experience to an enhanced degree, and this finding structure is how cognitive gain is normally conceptualized in psychology and neuroscience, and it is non-factive. So cognitive gain in this descriptive rather than factive sense is what explains why artworks and aesthetic experiences are pleasurable, insight-generating, transformative, and agency-enhancing. Now, I will talk to you very briefly about language, just to give you an example of what I mean and what I think this approach can tell us about language specifically. So, for example, if you take this sentence, which some people have considered as one of the best metaphors ever uttered in the English language, it was uttered by Edmund Burke, actually, in a remark that he made in Parliament in 1776, Spain, a great whale stranded on the shores of Europe. Now, if we ask why this is cognitively valuable in some way, we might try and unpack it to obtain some nuggets of knowledge of some specific kind. We may, for example, paraphrase it like this: Spain, this country whose cartographic representation has an enlarged form and is located on the borders of Europe, or like this, or like this, or like this. But the point is that none of these sentences have the same suggestiveness, the same property of generating insight as the original. So we need to ask what makes one more cognitively enriching than the other, right? So I take this is a problem of experience rather than truth. As Derek Attridge, a literary critic, points out, a text becomes a work of literature when it is the experience of reading it, hearing it, and seeing it perform, which constitutes the value or importance to the reader, listener, or viewer. It's something, he says, that has happened during the course of the experience that has left that individual different. So the point is that we need to study that experience, and we need to study, I think, exactly how we approach this, the question of what it is to generate cognitive gain. So in the perceptual domain, it is cognitive gain is guessing the structure of your sensorium, and in language, analogously, is guessing the structure or meaning of a linguistic expression. So this sort of process can be done with a lot of empirical tools. We can study, for example, eye tracking and reading times. We can do it with EEG studies, and more recently, we can do it with LLMs. And this is what I'm actively exploring with several colleagues. And the idea is that LLMs provide you, for example, with estimates about how each word in a sentence is surprising, roughly put, given the preceding context. So you can get images like this, or that very metaphor by Burke, images that tell you, for example, that whale is the most surprising word in the sentence, and then this surprise gets reabsorbed. So this sentence perhaps generates insight because it has this appealing narrow, sort of epistemic arc and generates a sort of gain, cognitive gain, the passage from not knowing, not understanding the sentence to understanding it. And I can skip this, but basically this tells you that in language, it's the same thing. We like things that are in between, that are not too randomic, not too easy to predict, but somewhere in between. So what I think this approach delivers is a better understanding of the sort of epistemic feelings that are generated by literature and language more generally. Because now we can link specific epistemic feelings like insight and pleasure, or surprise and confusion, or curiosity and suspense, or boredom, to specific dynamics in this work of hypothesis testing that we are constantly doing while experiencing language. And probably we can also understand better some of the features that are recurrently attributed to aesthetically effective language, features such as ambiguity, density, non-paraphrasability, lawful deviation from ordinary language, exactness, and reflexivity. I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want. But now let me just finish and outline what I think that this work gives us in terms of re-articulating the debate around aesthetic cognitivism. So we have seen that there are two senses of cognitive gain at stake in the debate on aesthetic cognitivism: a factive sense, commonly held among philosophers, and a descriptive sense, commonly held among cognitive scientists. These two senses, as I've tried to argue, are clearly separable because one can learn in a factive sense without having the impression of having learned, and vice versa. So if you read a recipe book, for example, you may acquire many truth propositions without having the sense of being enlightened in a particular way, right? But you can read, for example, conspiracy theories, have a sense of enlightenment, but not acquire any knowledge in a factive sense, right? So this means that the answer to the question of whether we gain cognitive from art in the factive sense does not even begin to answer the question of why art feels cognitively enriching. And what I've tried to argue is that it is the descriptive sense that has explanatory potential here, because there is nothing in the brain or in our phenomenology that marks true cognitive gain or acquisition of beliefs closer to truth, for example. There are instead, however, several behavioral and neurophysiological markers of cognitive gain in the descriptive sense we have defined. So we need the descriptive sense rather the factive one of cognitive gain if we want to explain the transformative, insight-generating, agency-enhancing character of art and aesthetic experience, which is arguably what prompted the question of whether we learn from art in the first place. So, trying to assess whether we gain cognitive from art and aesthetics experience in the factive sense is likely to yield, I think, an interesting answer. It depends. It depends on the sort of circumstances, the sort of reader or art viewer in question. The question of whether we gain cognitively from art and aesthetics in a descriptive sense rather has a sort of unified answer and a clear answer, as I've tried to show. We do so. Aesthetic experiences and cognitive gain are intimately related. This is shown by both the history of philosophy and these more recent sort of predictive processing approaches to the question. And this relation explains several aspects of our aesthetic encounters. So, in this revised sense, I think we can therefore adhere to the strong version of aesthetic cognitivism we started from, that is, cognitive yield is key, perhaps even essential to what it is to have an aesthetic experience. Last point, does it mean that we need to abandon altogether the factive question? What about the true cognitive gain then, right? I think that this picture sort of doesn't push us toward abandoning this question altogether. Rather, it refines it, and it points toward some of the way in which even this non-factive understanding of cognitive gain can be beneficial in a strong epistemic sense. I've put some options here. We can talk more about them later. But one of them, for example, is that art is connected to good epistemic behavior because, as some studies have shown, and I've put some of them here, when we undergo this aesthetic experience of finding structure in our sensorium, we are not just being successful in the moment, but we are also changing our attitude apparently towards environmental uncertainty, because we are becoming more confident that we will be able to understand, to grasp structure further on in time. So this can be seen as sort of art or cognitively engaging experiences, providing what John Keats, the poet, was referring to when talking about negative capability, the capacity to dwell in uncertainty, right? Also, art can increase sensitivity in lots of ways, but basically by providing us guesses or hypotheses about the shape of the world, it also provides us with a sensitivity towards different aspects of the world that are more or less expected. And also, of course, in this picture, art is connected to optimal cognitive functioning, because if we land in the sort of sweet spot of the inverted shape function, we are functioning cognitively in an optimal way, in a sense. So that's all I wanted to tell you about this. Thank you very much for your attention. Here are my collaborators, which I thank, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I have so many questions, but I'm going to open the floor and see if any of our other attendees have a question. We have about 20-25 minutes for discussion. Chris, nice to see you.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thank you. That was a really fantastic talk. I think most of my questions were about the factive cognitive divide. I'm quite satisfied by a lot of those answers you gave. So I just wanted to ask the model that you gave of predictive processing seemed to be to do with perception, right? Seemed to be a perceptual model. There's a lot of art that we engage with that's non-perceptual. Right. So I just wanted to hear a bit about that. I mean, what are we doing when we are what are we predictively processing when we're engaging with a literary work, but also with something like a conceptual artwork where we're just, I don't know, predictively processing idea. I don't really what's going on there on this model.
Right. I was hoping actually to be able to talk more about this. So thank you very much. Because indeed, in a predictive processing picture, given the sort of hierarchical structure also that I presented, there is a deep continuity between perception and cognition. They are not seen as sort of separate process in kind, but just in hierarchy. So when you are perceiving, you are sort of guessing low-level structures, like seeing a gestalt, for example. When you are reasoning, you are testing hypotheses at this most cognitive level. So the talk of hypothesis is indicative here, because hypotheses are the kind of sort of cognitive and abstract thing that scientists, for example, do, right? And the fact that to say that hypotheses are also active in our perceptual processes just marks this deep continuity that there is in the sort of predictive processing understanding of cognition and perception, which are to be thought as just the same process happening at different layers of this hierarchical structure, basically. So this story is meant to capture, of course, the sort of pleasure that we might get from conceptual art as well. So when I presented sort of Urinal by Duchamp or the Brillo boxes, what these people are doing, in a sense, is playing with these very high-level abstract predictions about how art should look like, right? They are sort of saying, as I said to you, here is a cow, then see the cow, but with the concept of art, right? So here is a Brillo box, see it as art. And if we succeed in doing so, we may gain the same sort of pleasure of insight that we gain in the sort of perceptual case. Thank you.
Plenty more to say there, no doubt, but we've got 4 more questions. Thanks, Chris. Guy.
Thanks very much. That was an exhilarating talk, really great. And I think the metaphor line seems to be spot on. I mean, really nicely done, and exciting to see that stuff with the large language models being applied. It's really fun, and great choice of metaphor too. Thank you. So my question is about about the kind of like dualistic structure of this, the two ideas of knowledge. So that the idea that the factive understanding of cognitive gain is somehow of a different order. Because it struck me as part of your description of the way in which we make perceptual sense of the Gestalt image of the cow gradually coming into the aspect, gradually dawning. You talked about kind of like perceptual processes in which we're basically reducing the mismatch between perception and Gestalt, or like a sense of what something should look like. And it struck me in a way that that's not so very different to how we arrive at factive understanding of the world, or like truth, in the sense that what we're trying to do continually, and we do this together with other people. This is not something we just do individually, is we're trying to reduce the mismatch between the representations we have of states of the world with everybody else's representations, and then trying to, like often in a very mundanely statistical way, trying to say, well, this is the kind of the case as it really is. So I wonder whether the kind of the division between the two is not, or the bridge between the two is, or whether we couldn't build a bridge between the two orders of cognitive gain.
Right, definitely. I mean, what I meant when I sort of pointed towards this distinction is that these things, in a sense, can come apart. As I said, one can have the experience of insight, right? Even if the insight, the sort of pattern that he or she finds turns out to be largely false. So that's definitely the reason to have this sort of distinction between sort of perceived learning, perceived cognitive gain, and actual epistemic progress, right? But it's also true that this sort of more non-factive version of cognitive gain is basically also what applies when we try to have these more epistemically charged kind of learning, right? We are trying to reduce the mismatch between our views of the world and the world itself. The point is that, according to this way of seeing things, we can't never say whether the structures that we find in the world are really there or not. And more importantly, that's not the point when it comes to explaining the power that art has on us, right? Because if we want to understand that, we need to understand this sort of process of insight generation, right? Which can turn out to be false, basically. Right. I don't know whether that answers all the question, but
No, I think that totally answers my question in the sense, but I just think in a way one can take it further in the sense that, so works of art often that we take to be persistently great or meaningful, we do manage. This is why our project in a way is so interested in what criticism does, because one way of characterizing what criticism does is it helps make this kind of like second bridge from making sense of a work to allowing a work to help us make sense of a world, or the world, and that's that's kind of part of this negotiation process, which can accurately be described as like reducing a mismatch. But it's just a sketchy thought. But it just struck me that there's also a possibility of a kind of like more continuous path towards an account of aesthetic cognitivism that might satisfy philosophers, if you see what I mean. I mean,
yeah, I mean, part of what you just said reminded me of one of the points that I had in the last slide when trying to see how this non-factive view of cognitive gain can also, I mean, have real epistemic benefits. When I was talking about sensitivity, I just meant that you can acquire through art hypotheses about how the world look like, but what matters is not whether these hypotheses are true or false. What matters is that now you are endowed with the capability of noticing things in the world, given these hypotheses, and revise these hypotheses as you go along. So you are sensitive to elements of your environment you weren't sensitive before engaging with that. So this might be a way of grounding some real epistemic power to art without resorting to that factive view of learning that is normally held in philosophy.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. Iris, nice to see you too.
Hi everyone. Nice to be here again. Thank you, Jacopo. This was really, really great, and I'm so interested to see how your project develops from when I first heard your talks about this. I think I want to push you just a bit further from this last question. And I'm still kind of uncertain as to how we are supposed to think of this idea that we feel pleasurable because we feel that we understand the work itself, in a sense that we know how the work of art works, right? We know its structure, we see its, layers, etc. And the idea that through this kind of understanding of the work, we actually gain an understanding of the world. And that's where the pleasure actually lies. And I guess as you were talking, what really comes to mind to me is just the very wide framework of Kantian aesthetics and the way in which some contemporary philosophers of science, you can think of Angela Breitenbach, how she describes the cognitive pleasure of scientific theories, where the idea is precisely the fact that the pleasure comes from your recognition of the way in which you are capable of understanding the world, which is precisely what Kant wants to kind of bring aesthetics towards. So I was just wondering whether there is this Kantian layer in your approach, whether it is in one way inspired by Kant, but also just how do we need to differentiate between these two ideas, that I understand the work and therefore I take pleasure in it because I just like the way this work is organized, or it is in virtue of this pleasure that I also understand the world, the reality, so to say, and that is what brings me pleasure.
Right. I think that's an important distinction to be made. I think that both processes are explainable within the same framework, right? There's finding connections, gaining insight, both of them. They are definitely present, both of them. One of them, gaining pleasure from the work itself, perhaps explains more aptly works with no representational works, basically, no, right? Where all you have is relationships between elements without bearing that do not bear to anything representational, anything about the world. On the other hand, you can capture with the same tools the sort of pleasure of understanding that applies to the world. So I definitely see connections between this view and the sort of view of scientific understanding that you were pointing us toward. But one of the important points is that scientific understanding in this sense is not the sort of experience that we get of insight while undergoing scientific understanding is not that different from the sort of experience that a conspiracy theorist, for example, undergoes when connecting the dots, right? But there are definitely these two aspects, finding relationship within the work and finding the relationship within the world. And with representational artworks, of course, one of the pleasures would be what the work is allowing you to do in terms of connecting the dots in reality, rather than just simply in the work itself. Right.
Good. Great question. Thank you. John.
Yeah, I'm struggling to figure out exactly how to put this question, but I found very interesting everything you had to say about factive approaches to the cognitive dimension. I found that very compelling. I found it compelling if we're thinking really compelling if we're thinking about the way debates on aesthetic cognitivism tend to privilege truth, and that might not be helpful. There's another reason we tend to think that it might be factive, and it's because it captures the notion of critical success pretty well. That's why when people have to explain what kind of understanding is relevant to aesthetic experience, they'll often use Allison Hills and say something like explanatory understanding or objectual olfactive. And one of the reasons they say that, presumably, is it would just be strange to say that a critic understands a work of art and they've successfully expressed that understanding to an audience, but they're wrong. Or that understanding is compatible it'd be odd to say, but it's compatible with being just false. Perhaps, I think. I'll leave it at that.
Right, very interesting. 2 points. One, I sort of share what I perceive is your dissatisfaction towards sort of views that consider truth as the important point while we're experiencing literature. That was indeed one of my starting points. I was coming from a philosophical background. I knew something about semantics, truth conditional semantics in particular. I wasn't finding in that tradition anything particularly compelling to explain the phenomenology of our aesthetic experience of literature or other things, right? So I turned towards these other approaches and this non-factive notion for that very reason. The question of what criticism does is an interesting one. I wish I had more time to develop that, because also part of the project that you are doing, of course. In a sense, if I am allowed to trivialize things a little bit, I find it not dissimilar what I've done when I told you that there was a cow in the picture, in a sense. That I pointed you towards a way in which you can arrange the material of the picture or of the poetry or literature in a productive way, basically. This doesn't mean that there is just one productive way of doing things, because poetry, unlike the cow picture, is inherently ambiguous, is more ambiguous. The ambiguity of art, of great artworks, is such as it cannot be reduced. You constantly are constantly kept guessing about the meaning of the artwork, and that's what makes the experience of art stronger and more profound than the sort of gimmicky example that I gave of the cow there. Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carl. Very nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Thank you very much for your talk. I really like your distinction between the factive and descriptive sense of cognitive engagement, and I agree with you that the descriptive needs to be prior to the factive. It's more important because, as you say, it fits the phenomenology of our experience of the arts. And it seems to be what we value the most, rather than learning a factual proposition about something. I wonder if you've considered how this view relates to John Dewey's distinction between perception and recognition. Perception is when you fall back on a stereotype, but recognition is that perception is a much richer experience in his aesthetics, where you mull over the possibilities that are suggested by the artwork. So it's a form of reflection that is much richer than perception. But my question has to do with whether your description of cognitive gain as descriptive can help us to distinguish between great works of art and mundane works of art. The reason I ask that question is that there's a book by Todd Berliner that recently, it's about Hollywood cinema, and it's called Hollywood Aesthetic. And what he argues is that Hollywood films engage in that same middle way that you talked about between, stereotypical perception and complexity that can't be made sense of, right? That's what Hollywood films do. And there's a sense in which all artworks do that. And so if you take this descriptive approach rather than the factive approach, it doesn't seem to me that it escapes the mundane nature of the "it depends" answer to whether a work of art is cognitively valuable, because that depends. The descriptive approach, the experience of our artwork, also depends on how familiar we are with stereotypes or genre conventions or narrative conventions, etc. So the nature of that experience, even if it's not factive, also depends on the viewer. It depends on the situation. It depends on whether the work of art is conventional or not. So I wonder if you've thought about that at all.
Right, definitely.
I think there are 3 different questions involved in there. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. They were all interesting. So about the Dewey distinction between recognition and perception, very interesting. I'll look more into that because it captures sort of part of the experiential spectrum I was pointing toward. There are percepts that are just more predictable. Basically, what we do there is recognizing them because we do not have that prolonged interactive engagement with them that perhaps is what perception, according to Dewey, entails. And there are percepts in which we are not able to do that for opposite reasons, not because they are too simple, but because they are too randomic and chaotic and so on. So about your point that it also depends for the descriptive view of cognitive gain. Yeah, so definitely. I mean, the part of the story and the reason for articulating the story is to explain differences in aesthetic appreciation, right? And the differences will be caused by where do you position yourself in a sort of optimum of unpredictability and ambiguity. Where is your sweet spot, right? The apex of the U curve, right? And experts will have it shifted more or less towards more complexity, novices towards more simplicity. The point, so, is it depends, of course. But what you can do with you can tell with certainty, I think, if you embrace this descriptive, non-factive view of learning, is that whenever people are having that experience of feeling inside or feeling they have learned something, they are occupying that optimum, right? That's something you can tell with sense. So it depends in that sense. It doesn't depend in this other sense. And indeed, about your question about differences between great work of art and mundane work of art, I don't think you can tell the difference in within this framework in a strong sense. All you can tell is probably that for this specific person, that artwork occupies or doesn't occupy that specific sweet spot or not. And of course, there are reasons to think that both mundane, very complex, and avant-garde artworks have their role to play in granting us our cognitive gain, because you cannot give, for example, James Joyce's Ulysses to a 5-year-old, right? But there is the need to have both sort of fables and mystery stories and this sort of high-level art, because each one of us occupies a different part of that spectrum, more or less. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Diana, who is our speaker in a couple of weeks. Really nice to welcome you. You'll get the last question.
Oh, that's very kind. I was going to lower my hand because I didn't want to keep people. No, thanks, Jacopo. Always enjoy hearing your talks. So yeah, I guess my question is also around this distinction, which is obvious because that's how you start, between factive and descriptive. And I guess I always struggle a little bit with aesthetic experience and whether it's everything or whether it should be sort of reserved for, super powerful experiences. And if I were to sort of consider these really powerful experiences, then I guess I would liken them to, for example, when we were all very young and for the first time we realized, hey, where did all of this come from? Like, you ask questions, really philosophical questions, like how did the world, why am I here, and so on. And in a way, it's almost us seeing past that automatic processing of the world, and that automatic processing, yes, we can sometimes be a little bit surprised by what we just heard, what we've just seen in art. But I feel like there's some really strong experiences where we actually crave the truth or what's real, what's really there, because we realize that all we are experiencing are being filtered by our existing models. So I just wondered, if there's a predictive processing account that could sort of, explain these potentially special type of aesthetic experiences. Maybe they're not aesthetic experiences. Maybe there's another term for it. But I just feel like sometimes art experiences can feel that powerful and maybe have us question what we thought we knew, and so on. And I guess it relates to something that I was going to ask, which was about, the meaningfulness of a piece of art, when it really does feel like more than just, discovery or let's say perceptual discovery.
Right. Yeah, no. Very good question. Thank you very much. So the sort of a special, mundane spectrum is something that I've been thinking a lot about. My view is basically that every experience is aesthetic experience in this broad sense of being intelligent to some extent, arrangement of sensory stimulations, basically. But of course, not all experience is aesthetic to the same degree. And to understand why certain experiences are more aesthetic than others, there is more profound, more articulate, more like they enhance more our understanding of the world, or at least they give us the impression of doing so. The things that we need in order to explain this difference is just the sort of hierarchical picture that I gave, some insight, sort of high-level insights about massive patterns in the world, and not localized, like, oh, I see the cow now, okay, so what, right? So hierarchy is a part of the sort of reason to think about the differences between high-level experiences and low-level mundane experiences, and also the sort of recursive, prolonged engagement that artworks and not stimuli such as the sort of Gestalt cow that I showed provide. Because, of course, the important thing is in the story that you keep guessing, that the stimulus that you are encountering is such that you are able to undergo many of these sort of epistemic arc and keep guessing all the time. So the experience that you have is of a more profound restructuring of your belief of the kind perhaps you were pointing us toward. And you had an interesting point there about us craving the truth, right? And I think that this story doesn't still sort of give us a way of capturing what sense of truth and why, in the sense that we sort of, there is this view of predictive processing as casting perception as control hallucination, so as something far remote from reality in a way, not a direct perception. But it's also true that this view tells us that as embodied models of the world, we have all the interest in finding out whether the structure that we are guessing from the environment exists or not. So it explains the cravings for truth that we have in that sense, sort of existentially profound sense, but it doesn't, of course, tell us whether we reach the truth or not, right? I don't know whether that answered more or less.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, unfortunately, it's 4:05, so we've got to round things off. But we're looking forward to the next session already, of course, with Diana and the 3 remaining sessions this term. But for now, let's thank Jacopo for a great talk, and thanks everybody for coming and great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you really to all for your engagement. It was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.